Going back in time a little bit, 23 years ago, Southern Evangelical was co-founded by Norman Geisler. That was the same time I started my undergraduate work. And I would have loved to have gone to a school like Southern Evangelical, but they didn't accept undergraduates at the time. So I went to a non-denominational evangelical college. I was going to major in biblical studies, minor in cross-cultural studies. I was going to be a missionary. I was going to be a Wycliffe Bible translator. My heart's cry was for the many peoples of the world who didn't have Scripture in their language. There's approximately 6,000 languages on planet Earth, and about half of them don't have even a shred of Scripture translated into their language. So that's what I planned to do, and going to this Bible college was going to help me with that, so I thought. But by the time the first semester was over, I was just filled with many, many questions. So many questions that were driving me crazy. I actually left the Bible school after the first semester and was transferred to a state school. Thought, hey, I'll study philosophy, I'll see if I can find some answers there. That didn't work. So I said, you know, I'm just going to go to Alaska. I'll hitchhike there if I need to, and I'm going to find work. I'm just going to try to find answers to my questions on my own. En route to Alaska, I stopped at my uncle's church. My uncle was Roy Knutson. He was an old school Dallas Seminary graduate, probably knew Lewis Sperry Chafer, and he'd been a pastor for 40-some years. And at some point I asked him, hey, do you have any advice for people who are struggling with doubt? And his answer was a little confusing to me at the time, but it gave me something that I've been thinking about for the last 22, 23 years. And his answer was, who would you rather be like, Billy Graham or Charles Templeton? I said, I know who Billy Graham is, but who's Charles Templeton? And he said, exactly, that's my point. And he went on to say that here's Charles Templeton, here's Billy Graham. These were two great evangelists of some former decade. He said that Charles Templeton was the greater evangelist, that he was the better known. If you wanted an evangelist to run a campaign, you would have called Chuck Templeton. And if he wasn't available, then you probably would have called Billy Graham as a secondary. That's approximately what he said. And he said, why is it, Chris, that you've never heard of Charles Templeton? And he said, well, he was struggling with doubt, and he went to Princeton, I believe, to try to investigate his doubts, and he became an agnostic. So these are the type of questions I want to talk about. All right, I just want to go through some jargon. So ISCA, or ISCA, International Society of Christian Apologists. Is it apologetics or apologists? Apologetics, yes. ICBI, International Council of Biblical Inerrancy. CSBI, Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. CSBH, Chicago Statement on Biblical Hermeneutics. ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. EPS, Evangelical Philosophical Society. And here's a word you may not be familiar with. I think I may have coined it. Paleo-inerrancy as opposed to neo-inerrancy. Now paleo, I don't mean to say, oh, it's outdated, it's old. I just mean it's the original. It's the original view of the Orthodox Church historically, going back to early church fathers, through Augustine, through the Middle Ages, through Aquinas, through the Reformers, and on into, I would argue, into the International Council of Biblical Inerrancy. Neo-inerrancy, I would say, I didn't want to say neo-evangelical. I hate to split hairs here, and I didn't want to say necessarily even neo-evangelical, because I think there can be people who arguably are mostly evangelical, who may still challenge paleo-inerrancy, and I will get to that in a minute. Also, some of the other possibilities were just maybe a little bit pejorative. But you may have heard some other terms for it. traditionalists versus progressives. That would probably be a good way to say it. All right, so the first thing I wanted to respond to is, what does the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy mean by grave consequences? That's actually how the statement ends. Another question that I hope to respond to is inerrancy a catalyst for apostasy? Is inerrancy a peripheral matter? And is paleo-inerrancy disqualified by its dependency upon Scottish common sense realism? Now, these may not necessarily be the most important questions that one could ask about some of the debates, but these are the ones that caught my attention. These were the ones that made me say, wow, that's interesting. I want to rethink that. And also, another thing that may make them a little more important is they can be indicators. They keep getting recycled. Every 10 or 15 years they pop up. A new person seems to recycle one or more of these in his own words. So I think chances are they'll probably be recycled into the future, and when you see that, you can recognize it and kind of know where this person is headed and or what side he or she may be on. Now, Dr. Geisler already talked about the objection of, hey, this is just a matter of interpretation, not a matter of inerrancy. I'm going to try to also touch on that, maybe share a few quotes. I'm not going to try to overlap with what he said, but what I'll say is in harmony with what he said. And I'm actually doing 2 sessions today, so I might actually save this for the second session. We'll see how time goes. Answering the zombie problems of Matthew 27. This is kind of an extension of the interpretation challenge. There are some uncomfortable questions raised by the raising of the saints in Matthew 27. So I hope to give a response to those. Again, that'll probably be in the second session. All right, what exactly does CSBI mean by grave consequences? And here's the statement. Article 19. We deny that such confession is necessary for salvation. However, we further deny that inerrancy can be rejected without grave consequences, both to the individual and to the church. Let's take the first half of that. We deny that such confession is necessary for salvation. Well, that's kind of interesting. That made me stop and think a little bit. An argument could be made that looks a little bit like this. I'm not necessarily making this argument. I'm just saying that this would be natural for some people to think through with this. They could say, all right, so inerrancy is not necessary for salvation, point 1. Point 2, well, apologetics, which is pre-evangelism, and evangelism are necessary for salvation. Therefore, inerrancy is not necessary when doing apologetics and evangelism. It seems like, I'm not saying it's a perfectly valid syllogism, but I think it would be natural for some people to think this way, and I think some people do think this way. So I guess we can just end the presentation now and go home. No. And a lot of people say, look, hey, leave us alone. We're doing pre-evangelism. We're doing evangelism. We're not trying to make theologians out of these people. We're just trying to get them saved. But there's a however statement. This is how the CSBI ends. It says, however, we further deny that inerrancy can be rejected without grave consequences, both to the individual and to the church. Now, the person who brought this to my attention was a fellow who was, I'd say, a significant apologist. He writes a popular blog. He actually calls himself an inerrantist, and I think he might be right. He signs a statement saying that he agrees with CSBI pretty frequently, and he seems sincere to me. He also seemed very reasonable and intelligent. He forced me to rethink this, because what he said was, I agree with everything in CSBI except for these 2 words, grave consequences. He says, I think inerrancy is important. I don't think the consequences would be grave. I mean, grave is such a strong word. And so he made me start to rethink that. One of the thoughts I had was, okay, well, what does grave consequences mean? Are we talking about, does God bring discipline on scholars and teachers who who don't hold to inerrancy or who propagate something that's not an uncompromising stance on inerrancy. Here, 1 Corinthians 11, we hear of a passage that says, hey, some of you are weak and ill. Some of you have died. This is God's discipline. Is this what we're talking about for grave consequences? Or is it something else? 1 Corinthians 3 talks about a judgment that has really nothing to do with your salvation. This is not are you justified or not. This is a subsequent judgment where it's about rewards. And for some workmen who are doing ministry, they might possibly suffer loss, though he himself will be saved as only through the fire. Is that what we're talking about in terms of grave consequences? Maybe, maybe not. But I started thinking about it and I thought, well, I think of some of the scholars that I've learned a lot from who were not necessarily inerrantists. C.S. Lewis, for instance, F.F. Bruce. They made important contributions to the defense of the faith. Are they going to be stripped of rewards? Were they disciplined in life? Well, this is above my pay grade. I don't know the answer to these questions, but I hope that someday I can have a tenth of the impact that C.S. Lewis has on the world. So it made me. I'm just thinking this through. You see. So a little clarification would be nice. Now, where would you go to get clarification on the ICBI? On the CSBI? Well, there's some good answers to that. And here it is. I don't know if you can see it well. This is Explaining Biblical Inerrancy, the official commentaries on the ICBI statements. A little hard to read. It's 2 books. The first book is by Dr. Spurl. The second book is by Dr. Geisler, put together into one unit. There are 2 different commentaries. One is the commentary on the CSBI, written by Dr. Spurl. This in an official capacity, authorized by the ICBI. And of course, the second one is Explaining Hermeneutics. This is a commentary by Dr. Geisler on the CSBH. So if you're unclear about something in the CSBI or CSBH, this would be the place to start. Now, of course, there's also a larger ICBI corpus that you can look at, but this would be the place to start. And that's what I did to get clarification on the question of grave consequences. As an aside, we at ISCA are actually encouraged to download and read this book, Explaining Biblical Inerrancy. You can see it. You can actually get it at ISCA Apologetics. I truncated it to make it easier to find, or you can go to bastionbooks.com, put in this coupon code. It's case-sensitive free, capital F-R-E-E dash EBI. EBI is capitalized. So if you put in that coupon code, you'll get the book for free. I would say, unless Dr. Geisler has any objections, I'd say share that with anyone and everyone who might read it. I would love to see this book be in the electronic library of every Bible teacher, every professor, even every serious Bible student. I would love this to be in their library. So what does that commentary say? What did R.C. Spurl say in an official capacity representing ICBI about the grave consequences? This is what he said. We believe that history has demonstrated again and again that there is all too often a close relationship between rejection of inerrancy and subsequent defections from matters of the Christian faith that are essential to salvation. So it does have some bearing on salvation in some way. Now this is an important clarification. It doesn't answer all questions that we might ask. It leaves a little bit of vagueness, but I think that's on purpose, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Notice history. This is a historical argument. Dr. Spurl is saying that history has demonstrated this. He's not saying this is a biblical argument. This is what history has shown. If you're ignorant of history, then you may not understand this. But those who have seen the modernist controversies, seen the influx of neo-Orthodox thinking after World War II into the intelligentsia of evangelicalism, influence of Karl Barth, for instance, you'll understand this. And these were some of the catalysts for creating the ICBI summits. a close relationship. Doesn't mean that it's going to cause a problem every single time, but there is a close relationship. Again, helpful clarification. Now, this is kind of a gentleman's way of saying it, I think. History has demonstrated again and again that there's all too often a close relationship. This is a picture of a dam. You can see the dam is breaking. To me, what R.C. Sproul said could be somewhat analogous to saying, yes, we think that history has shown again and again that all too often there is a correlation between a large crack in a dam and eventually the dam having catastrophic failure. That's kind of the way I see it. May not happen instantly, but give it some time and you don't want to be below that dam when it breaks. Now there's a very similar quote that I think harmonizes very well with it. This is from Carl Henry. Evangelicals do not dispute the fact that for a time at least, Christianity may function with an impaired doctrine of Scripture, but it does so at its own peril and inevitably must then lose much of its essential message. Now, Carl Henry wasn't actually part of the first summit. He was invited. He was entreated to join. He didn't do it at that time. He was very interested in it. He did play a very large part in the second council on hermeneutics, though, and the third as well. And really, I think he's saying basically the same thing that R.C. Sproul was saying, just in slightly different words. So, for a time, you might be able to get away with a limited inerrancy view for a time, possibly, and even that's questionable. But inevitably, something's going to happen. So, here's another picture. So here's a person walking on ice. Sorry, it's hard to see. You can usually get away with walking on ice for a while. But you can also get a little overconfident with that, and what's eventually going to happen? I used to live in Alaska, and there was a lake that people would drive their cars on in the winter. Usually, you could drive your car or four-wheel drive truck on the lake just fine. Usually. But more than one car sank into the lake for people being overconfident about that. All right, so what are we talking about for grave consequences? Well, I would respond saying there are multiple precedents in history. The mechanisms that drive it may be subtle, but they are very substantial. You might be able to get away with it in the short term, but in the long term, that's what I'm mainly concerned about, is long term. And you may have professors who are limited inerrantists, and they may go their entire lives, their entire professional careers, promoting limited inerrancy, and they may not become unorthodox themselves. They may still hold to the cardinal doctrines in an orthodox fashion. But then they may toe the lines. They may say something like, well, you know, I think that the Apostle Peter was an apostate. Now, this doesn't violate any cardinal doctrines of orthodoxy, but this is, and the professor may know, yeah, I can get away with this. I might want to say some other things, but I'm not going to question the resurrection out loud and say, oh, it was just a spiritual, not a bodily resurrection. You know, a lot of professors will know, regardless of what their own opinion is, they'll know, hey, I can't get away with that at this time. So I'm not going to say that. So I'll say something less, like, yeah, Peter was an apostate, which did happen recently, by the way. And what I think I'm even more concerned about is the students. Very often the student is more radicalized than the teacher. Sometimes when the teacher opens Pandora's box a little bit, the students may take that, they may run with it, and they may, the seed may germinate. That's where the word seminary comes from. Seminal, it's where seeds are implanted in students' minds. Well, you plant a little mustard seed in a student's mind of, well, this part of the gospel wasn't historical. It didn't really actually happen. And if you do that in a place where there's nothing in the text that gives you the right to do that, if you just, especially if you go outside of the text, you go to secular literature, then what kind of seed does that plant in the student's mind? And what will that seed germinate into later? And then what about the next generation after that? I think that's what I'm mainly concerned about. All right, and the question of grave consequences leads me to the term shipwreck. Now, this is an important term in the New Testament. It really only shows up explicitly one time, but it shows up a few other times as well. So I wanted to mention that. Before I do, Paul was actually shipwrecked twice. He knows a little bit about shipwreck. When I lived in Alaska, I actually worked on 3 small boats in the commercial fishing industry. So this is part of why it's grabbed my attention. I know a little bit about shipwreck as well. Was almost shipwrecked. Was almost washed overboard. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about shipwreck real quick. All right, 1 Timothy 1, Paul talking to Timothy in the context of what is shipwreck. He says, "Charge certain persons not to teach different doctrine, nor to devote themselves to myths which promote speculations." He describes these people as having wandered away from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. He also describes them as having wandered away from sound doctrine in accordance with the gospel. He describes them as having made shipwreck of their faith. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about shipwreck. I'm talking about let's be very careful. And I think as apologists, we have a special role in trying to prevent shipwreck and avoid shipwreck and deal with people who have run their boats onto reefs and need to be rescued. So, and that's kind of the overarching talk of this presentation. Now, shipwreck, we know for one example from Paul that Alexander and Hymenaeus, they for instance made shipwreck of their faith, and in the context there, it was I believe we know for Alexander, he said the resurrection has already happened, and Paul handed him over to Satan, whatever that means. Took it very, very seriously. Hymenaeus, not necessarily the same thing, but this happens. And this is interesting to me because Paul names names. In those networks of local churches in Paul's day, these were not just guys who hung around. These were teachers. They could go from different church to different church, and they could teach their doctrine of the resurrection having already happened. Paul names names, he sometimes summarizes their views, and he condemns it. I'll even say, he describes it as shipwreck. Says, hey, this man needs to be handed over to Satan, whatever that means. It's strong language. Also, I think we see the same imagery in Ephesians 4 of shipwreck. We see that Jesus gave the church apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds or pastors, and teachers. Why? So that we can all attain to the unity of the faith, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning and craftiness and deceitful schemes. All right, so tossed about to and fro by the waves and winds. This is shipwreck technology, terminology. What happens? Well, if nothing else, the best case scenario for such a ship is you're not going to go where you were planning to go. You're going to end up somewhere else. Other possibilities, you capsize, you sink. So this is kind of the same language of shipwreck. And I think in this list, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, we don't see apologists. Apologist isn't necessarily one of the gifts Christ gave the church, but I think from my view, and I think an apologist can very often fit all of these. Apologist can at times play the role of an apostle with a lowercase a. Sometimes an apologist may need to play the role of the prophet. Definitely apologetics should lead to evangelism. Shepherding, pastoring, there are times where the apologist needs to do that. Teaching, huge part of apologetics. So for that reason I say let's take this very seriously and not just I'm not just trying to vilify others. I'm saying, hey, let's watch our own lives. Be wary when you think you're strong lest you fall. We need to watch out for ourselves and for our own flocks, and then I think for just the larger network, the communities of people who try to take the Bible seriously. I think apologists have an important role for all of these groups. One more instance, I'll throw this out. This is from Jude. Also, very similar language to Paul. He doesn't use the word shipwreck, he uses the word hidden reeves. He said, hey, I found it necessary to write you, to contend for the faith, which is what apologists do, right? The faith that was for once and all delivered to the saints. Why? Well, certain people have crept in unnoticed. Now, there's some subtlety here. There's some deception. There is a little intrigue. Conspiracy here. People, this happened in Jude's day. This happened in the first century. It's happened throughout church history. It'll happen to us as well. It's happening right now. People creep in, and they're unnoticed. They're not going to have a sign on their foreheads saying, I'm an apostate, or I have made shipwreck of my faith. They're not going to do that. What are they? Jude says they are hidden reeves at your love feasts, as they feast with you without fear. They have no fear. Why should they be afraid? Because we all love each other, you know? It's all about love, right? They don't have anything to fear, because we don't even know that they're dangerous. But what are they? They're hidden reeves. So when you are sailing your boat through the seas, these are reeves that are going to hit your boat and potentially ruin things. Also describes these people as having a rejected authority, following the ways, the errors, and rebellions of other men. I think apologists have a role to let's try to prevent this, detect it early, nip it in the bud. All right, so grave consequences. Again, R.C. Sproul said this is based on historical precedent. And I tried to visualize this. I wanted to create a picture. And this is just the way I see it. I'm not trying to speak for anyone else here. I hope this isn't too hard to see. You see kind of a spectrum here on the evangelometer, or the shipwreckometer, as you might call it. On this side, anything here is shipwreck. Once you've reached this point, you're shipwrecked. So atheism, obviously, shipwrecked faith. Agnosticism, both hard and soft. Deism, finite godism. Process theism, which is very common in liberal Protestantism. Now, neo-Orthodox Protestant Christianity, there's a little ambiguity here. I mean, you're still in shipwreck danger, but you're not necessarily in the same category as atheism. You're still holding on to at least a little truth. Neo-Orthodox is known for being very Christocentric. That's also what makes it very subtle. It seems to glorify Christ. It seems to maintain Orthodox doctrines, and yet as you can see, this is actually the color orange. I say that it's extremely dangerous, and I'm sure that's what R.C. Sproul was saying in terms of his historical precedents that he was talking about. Now, continuing the spectrum, you've got neo-evangelical Christianity. Maybe a little less dangerous, but still somewhere in the danger zone. And then my term here, neo-inerrancy, the type of evangelicals who purport neo-inerrancy. You know, they straddle the green and the yellow. So yes, there's reason for caution. They're mostly good doctrine. Now here's what I call paleo-inerrancy, or paleo-evangelicalism. They're in the green, as in this is good doctrine. This is not shipwreck. Your ship is not stuck on the reefs. Here's fundamentalism, also in the green. Hyper-fundamentalism maybe gets a little yellow, some occasional concerns there. Hope I'm not ruffling too many feathers with that. So that's my way of seeing it. Now, in this spectrum, one of my concerns is that there's a tendency to slide. And I don't want to commit the slippery slope fallacy of logic, but I have to say that the law of gravity does work. Once you start into that spectrum and go from paleo-inerrancy to limited inerrancy, And then it's not difficult to slide into neo-orthodoxy, and then full-blown liberalism, and then, as we will see soon, to go into actual agnosticism. So, and this is what I'm talking about. Let's beware of the slippery slope. Again, it may not happen in the short term, but it's there. All right, next topic. Is inerrancy a catalyst for apostasy? Now, I know this may sound crazy to some people. Inerrancy causing people to lose their faith, causing the ships to shipwreck, if you will. This may sound crazy. This grabbed my attention. It grabbed my attention because most of my lay ministry has been for people who have lost their faith. They grew up with some type of flavor of Christian faith. They left the church, they left the faith, and for whatever reason, that's just the people I meet at work tend to fit that category well, and that's been probably the lion's share of my ministry over the years, is talking to people like that. So that's why this got my attention. I care about people who are in danger of apostasy. In fact, I've coined another term. You hear apologetics is sometimes called pre-evangelism, and then there's evangelism. Well, I have another term. It's re-evangelism. And that's what I do a lot of. And I would like to avoid having to do re-evangelism if possible, and I think apologists can play a very important role in preventing apostasy or ministering to those who have lost their faith. Now, so this is the way the argument goes. Now, when you hear this on, say, a YouTube video or a blog, which is usually where this type of argument shows up, they're not going to lay it out logically for you. They're just going to kind of blast it at you and not really give you time to think about it. But so I'm breaking it down into what I think would be the way to express it logically. I would say that, and this could take variations. So they would say something like, our beliefs, our doctrines, they can be linked together like a chain. For instance, believing Jesus is the Son of God. Well, that's contingent on believing that there is a God. You know, simple stuff. So that's what I mean by linking beliefs together as a chain. Also, you have to believe in a plurality of persons in one divine essence. So with that in mind, the second part of the argument is a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Now they would say inerrancy is a weak link. Now, they could be saying this in two ways. They could say inerrancy is a weak link for one of two reasons. Either it is weak because there really are actually errors in the Bible, and that's why it's weak, because eventually, as you grow up and leave your juvenile thinking, you're going to realize, wait a minute, the Bible is full of contradictions and problems that I can't reconcile, and they must be errors. So that's one way this could go, is to say, yes, inerrancy is a weak link because there are errors. Another way they could go is to say, oh, no, I'm not saying that. I uphold inerrancy. The Bible has no errors, but this is still a weak link anyway, because there are problems, the difficult passages in the Scriptures that are difficult for the mind to resolve. And and they're not actually errors, they're just challenges. And what happens is when young people, when they start thinking like adults and reading, literature by scholars, they're going to get confused. They may just not be able to believe that inerrancy is something that can be upheld. All right, so fourth part of the argument. When a believer cannot resolve one or more apparent errors or contradictions in the Bible, his or her inerrancy link is severed. So there's the bolt. All right, there's the bolt cutters. So when that happens, regardless of whether the Bible does or doesn't have errors in it, if you get to that point where you think it has an error, this link is severed. Those who place the inerrancy link at the top of the chain lose the entire faith. Every link in the chain that's beneath that falls. When I cut this link, every link beneath it falls. Therefore, and you'll find inerrantists saying this, people who would say, yes, the Bible has no errors in it, they will still conclude this. They will say, not some will conclude, that therefore it is wise only to place the inerrancy link at the bottom of the chain of beliefs. So that's an argument. I wanted people to be aware of that. That's not uncommon. Usually you find it in the blogs. So I wanted to respond to this. My first response is a hesitation on my part, a hesitation in accepting their argument. And this is from Jeremiah. He says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" So as somebody who has struggled with his faith and flirted with apostasy, even had his ship stuck on the reefs for a season, with the clarity of hindsight, I can say for myself, this was true of me. When I was suffering from doubts, if you had asked me, are these doubts intellectual? When I was suffering from them, I would have said, oh yes, I can rattle off 20 easily of intellectual things I'm struggling with. Time passed, fast forward a few years, and I realized that it was actually more of a heart issue. I was bitter with God. And once that bitterness was taken care of, some other people agree, I'm not the only one. So once that root of bitterness was taken care of, everything looked different. A lot of those intellectual doubts either disappeared or they looked totally different. They stopped being doubts and they became challenges, questions, things that I was eager to pursue and look at again. So my first response about the question of does inerrancy serve as a catalyst for apostasy is, well, hey, don't just listen to apostates and don't just blindly trust what they're saying about what caused their faith to fail. They may not know, or they may not understand their own hearts. Now, there is a book by Kinnaman called You Lost Me. It's a collection of true stories of people who lost the faith and or left the church. And I think that there can be valuable insights. If you have somebody who's good at, like Kinnaman, who I believe used to be part of the Barna group, if you have somebody who's good at taking surveys and getting to the root of what's there, or maybe even a sociologist doing a rather scientific study, I think there's some value in listening to apostates and people who have shipwrecked and say, what happened? Why did your faith shipwreck? I'm not saying you can't learn from that. I'm just saying when an apostate says, hey, I lost my faith and it's because I grew up as a fundamentalist with a strong view of inerrancy, just take that with a grain of salt. They don't necessarily know their own hearts. That's my first response. My second response is, can you give me any case studies? And this is one of the frustrating things. And again, this is in books. This is in books and blogs. There usually are no case studies given. It's usually a kind of a vague, oh, trust me, I get lots of letters. I get lots of emails from people saying, oh, I grew up fundamentalist. I had a strong view of inerrancy. And then one day, I grew up and realized, hey, the Bible has some difficulty in it that my mind can't reconcile. Therefore, I'm going to take the entire Bible and throw it out. Just walk away from it. Walk away from the entire faith because of one little doubt I found. And they don't usually name names. They just say, trust me. I get lots of emails. I get lots of people who come up to me after I speak and they tell me this. And that got my attention. I'm like, wow, is this a problem? Should we be concerned about this? Then my second thought is, well, wait a minute. We need some actual case studies. We need to really, if we're going to think about this, we need some names. Name some names. So here's a quote from a review. This is Daniel Wallace's review of a book by Holding and Peters called Defining Inerrancy. He says the authors note that many evangelicals who have abandoned the faith precisely because they started out with such a hardening of the categories. Now this rings true. I get countless emails from people who have either jettisoned their beliefs, or know people who have, because their own starting presupposition is that it's inerrancy or nothing. All right, so again, who are we talking about? Show me some names. I did find one name in a blog by William Lane Craig at reasonablefaith.org. What is inerrancy? He actually names a name. He has his own version of this argument. He takes it very seriously, and that's one of the things that made me take it seriously, of people jettisoning their entire faith, chucking the faith because they found one error. He actually names Bart Errorman. There he is. And I started thinking about that. I was like, wow, this is serious. You know, this is what apologists need to be serious about, is preventing people from becoming Bart Ehrmans. Then I thought, wait a minute. I've listened to Bart Ehrman talk. I know a little bit about him. Does this really fit the facts? I thought, wait. And I reviewed the facts, and I said, wait a minute. No, this didn't happen. Now, the way it gets told by William Lane Craig is that Bart Ehrman grew up in a fundamentalist Christian tradition. Went to Moody Bible Institute, went to Wheaton, graduated, and then he went on to, I just forgot where, to study under Bruce Metzger at, I believe, Princeton. Anyway, so in his PhD studies, he wrote a paper. The professor wrote a comment as he graded it saying, maybe the apostle was wrong. Maybe the apostle wrote an error into the Gospels. And Bart Ehrman hadn't thought of that. He's like, whoa, wow, wait a minute. Suddenly his mind is opened, and then he chucks the faith. I think that may not be too much of an exaggerated view of what William Lane Craig was saying. But there's a problem with this, a big problem, a huge problem with this. I would say it much differently. Having re-examined the facts about Bart Ehrman and his deconversion, that part is true about his mind being opened by one of his professors to the possibility that the Bible has errors. But that was not when he just chucked the entire faith and chucked the Bible. That's when he started to chuck inerrancy. Now, he didn't chuck his faith for several years. In fact, he spent 15 years as a theologically liberal Christian. 15 years. Which, you know, we can still say his faith was shipwrecked, but he did not just chuck the faith. He went for a transmogrified version of the Christian faith. 15 years, and then it was the problem of suffering. There was a tragedy that struck someone in his family, and then he could not hold to his liberal Christian faith anymore, and pronounced himself agnostic. So I'm not sure Bart Ehrman is a really good example. In fact, I think Bart Ehrman is an example of the exact opposite principle of, it's not one little challenge to inerrancy and you chuck your faith. No, it's you get training at Princeton or such from liberal scholars. And I'm not trying to say anything bad about Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger, tremendous scholar, has, you know, there's a tremendous amount we can learn from textual criticism from him, but he wasn't an inerrantist. And the vast majority, or all, of his professors there in his graduate studies were not inerrantists. So I would say that what this to me proves, this case study suggests that you go on to higher education, and when you're bombarded by your professors that you can't trust the Bible, that's what is the real catalyst. All right, next case study. I've already mentioned this fellow, Charles Bradley Templeton, also known as Chuck Templeton. So here he is. You can tell he is an evangelist. And his pattern is very similar to that of Bart Ehrman. Sorry. So there's this picture again. Here's Templeton. Here's Billy Graham. Again, Templeton was on the greater ascendancy, if you will, in popularity. He was the greater evangelist, for lack of a better term. They both were challenged by liberal criticisms of the Bible. They both took him seriously. They both struggled. Billy, in his autobiography, he says, hey, I struggled with this. I struggled hard with it. And there was a difference, though. Chuck Templeton, he said, I'm going to go on to graduate studies. I need to learn more. I need to tackle these doubts. I need to answer these questions. And he actually begged Billy Graham to go with him. Billy Graham chose not to. So they went their separate ways. Then they remained friends. But they took very different paths. Chuck Templeton became a liberal Christian for several years. And it gets worse. Before I go there, though, Billy Graham took a different path. He basically went to his knees and he said, God, there are things in the Bible that I don't understand. There are some things that I can't even quite reconcile with my little finite mind. But you know what? I trust you, God. I trust who you are, and I trust your revelation. And just because I don't get it, just because I don't understand it, doesn't mean I'm going to doubt it. So now what happened to Chuck Templeton? This is Chuck Templeton's cover of his biography. Farewell to God, my reasons for rejecting the Christian faith. So this fits Bart Ehrman's precedent rather well. In fact, they're almost mere identical things in my mind. The slide I talked about is you start off with a drift away from an uncompromising stance on inerrancy. And next thing you know, you're going through the spectrum of liberal theological beliefs, which at some point you might as well just call Christian agnosticism. And then maybe one little event happens, a little extra tragedy in life, and suddenly you do fully, in every sense of the term, chuck the faith. And you give your reasons for rejecting the Christian faith. One interesting thing about Templeton, on his deathbed, or as he was dying, I believe he said to Lee Strobel, now let me back up. Lee Strobel said, now you really appreciate a lot about Jesus. And even though this agnostic had chucked his faith, he said, yes, everything good in my life I learned from Jesus. And then he went on to say, I miss my Savior. Now, I'm not saying he came back to the faith. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But anyway, this is the type of danger I'm talking about. This is what I want apologists to be aware of. This could happen to you. This could happen to your family members, your church members. This could happen to great scholars. This has happened to great scholars. All right, one more quick precedent. Reza Aslan, he's, I almost hate to bring him up. But, he's a Muslim now, but he didn't grow up Muslim. He's from, he's Iranian American. He grew up evangelical. But I'm pretty sure he was not familiar with the Chicago statements at all. And here's what happened to him. Again, this is the same precedent as Ehrman and Templeton. He had his evangelical faith until he went to university and started studying from professors with liberal views. Sorry, there's a picture of Reza. And here's a quote from NPR. I chose NPR on purpose. This is not my own spin on things. This talks about Reza Aslan. Says, as he got older, he began his studies in the history of Christianity, and he started to lose his faith. Bye-bye evangelicalism. And then he became very angry and resentful, turned away from Christianity. There's a little emotional. It's not just intellectual, it's emotional too. And then here, Aslan continued his Christian scholarship. So again, I think this is a third precedent for liberal studies eroding and corroding faith. So if we were going to be like sociologists and try to tackle this problem and say, hey, does a staunch view of inerrancy or does an overdose of inerrancy cause apostasy? If we wanted to be scientific about it, like sociologists might be, and go talk to ex-evangelicals and find out what happened to them, I think it's possible that a few might say, yeah, I found one error and I chucked the faith. I think that's possible. But I think if so, that's a minority. I think the majority are going to fit the Templeton, Aslan paradigm, Bart Ehrman paradigm as well. which to me looks a little like this. See this cartoon? You start here at the top, Christianity. Again, you kind of got your downward slide. You start with Christianity, and the Bible's not, sorry, the Bible, you progress to saying, oh, the Bible's not infallible. Then next thing you know, you're saying man is not made in God's image. Then you're saying, hey, there's no real miracles. God doesn't intervene in human history. Then no virgin birth, no deity, no atonement, no cardinal doctrine's gone. No resurrection, and then you're left with what? Agnosticism. So this cartoon, I think, is rather profound. I think it fits, at least the case studies that I found, much better than the objection that's been thrown. The descent of the modernists. So that's what I'd predict. I'd say if you could find a serious sociologist to do a study on this, this is what I predict he's going to find. Feel free to prove me wrong. All right, so here you see, to ask, does inerrancy serve as a catalyst for shipwreck, for apostasy? To me, that's a little bit like asking, do lighthouses cause shipwrecks? And what I see, when I read the statements of affirmation and denial in the CSBI and the CSBH, what I see are a group of men who saw so many shipwrecks that they decided, hey, we're going to set up a series of lighthouses along the coast. And with these lighthouses, as you sail your vessel, you can have parameters to navigate in. And if you go too far to the left on this side, you're in danger. If you go too far to the right of that parameter, you're in danger. That's how I see CSBI and CSBH, lighthouses that are meant to help prevent shipwreck. In fact, I would go so far as to say, I can't prove it, but I would predict that if Bart Ehrman, if Chuck Templeton, if Reza Aslan, for a more contemporary example, if they had been schooled on the parameters that ICBI gives, it might have helped prevent the erosion and corrosion of their faith. I really believe that. In fact, I would say that if I had been schooled in CSBI and CSBH in my earlier days, 22 years ago, 23 years ago, it might have helped me quite a bit too. I'll say it helps me now, for sure. All right, next topic. Is inerrancy a peripheral matter? This caught my attention because I had trouble arguing with it at first. When it was presented to me, and again, usually it's presented in some type of blog, although I mainly got it from William Lane Craig. He has a version of it that at first I was like, this is really hard to argue with. I also saw the same version on a Facebook post by Michael Licona. I'm friends with Mike Licona on Facebook, and I get to see his posts once in a while. And he was explaining something to somebody, and he explained that inerrancy is a peripheral matter, and he said, let's think in terms of concentric circles. I'll get to that in just a second. And he said that he learned this from Gary Habermas. So this caught my attention. I'm like, all right, William Lane Craig, Mike Licona, Gary Habermas, they think in terms of concentric circles, in terms of what are we going to defend. So here's a little bit, this is actually, these examples are from Mike Licona, from Facebook. And he says, all right, so here's your bullseye. Your central, non-peripheral, your fundamentals, your central importance thing. This is the bullseye. These are things that are essential for salvation. And he points out, predictably, you've got the deity of Jesus Christ, the humanity of Jesus Christ, the atoning death of Jesus Christ, resurrection of Jesus Christ. A+. No argument. Amen. And he says, all right, secondary importance. Now he says this is very important, and he puts the inspiration of Scripture there. Virgin birth, etc. Whatever that means. And then in the third ring, the peripheral matters, spiritual gifts, women as pastors, biblical inerrancy. Okay, so that's his view. William Lane Craig says something very similar. And so as I internalized this and started to struggle with it and think, okay, well this on one hand, this is hard to argue with. when he paints this picture, I'm like, I could accept that. But then I was like, wait a minute, there's some problems here, and I had to think about it a while. The first thing I thought of was, wait a minute, in terms of labeling things as central, crucial and then critical and peripheral, this sounds familiar. Now this slide is taken mainly from a book by Dr. Norman Geisler and Rhodes co-author from 2008. This book is called Conviction Without Compromise. Great book to have. It's a little hard to find. Get it while you can. So this slide is mainly taken from that book, with a little bit of augmentation from Volume 1 of Dr. Norman Geisler's Systematic Theology. So I thought, wait a minute, this whole bullseye concentric circle thing, this reminds me of Conviction Without Compromise. In fact, Geisler and Rhodes have a very sophisticated form. They're well known for this, in dividing the essential doctrines from the non-essential doctrines. In fact, they say there are 14 essentials that are essential for salvation. And then there are at least 12 that are, they're important, but they're not necessarily essential. We can debate about those, and there can be some liberty. But as apologists, we need to focus mainly on the salvation essentials. Now, there's a difference. You may have seen in Lacona's concentric circles, the way he painted it, there's a difference. Here, I don't know if it's fair to say this is at the core. I would paint it differently. In fact, I will paint it differently. But there's some additions that Geisler and Rhodes have. There are a different kind of essentials. They're not salvation essentials. They're revelational essentials, interpretational essentials, philosophical essentials. Without these, this becomes very, I don't know if I have a word for it. How about this? Just ethereal, very plastic. So again, Conviction Without Compromise, it touches on this, doesn't go too deep into it. If you want to go deep into it, get Volume 1 of Dr. Geisler's Systematic Theology. It goes very deep into it. In fact, in Volume 1 of Dr. Geisler's Systematic Theology, he has several chapters devoted to what he calls preconditions of theology. I would say, just for the sake of the preconditions, get the book. I loved it, and very helpful. And it's unique. As far as I know, there are no other systematic theologies that go into depth for these type of essentials other than Dr. Geisler's Systematic Theology. So high recommendations for that. So here's Dr. Craig's version of it. Instead of using concentric circles like a target, he makes it a little more complicated. He uses a spider web, which again has concentric circles. And I think what he's saying is, when you're trying to help a person come to faith, you start with the central things. Does God exist? We're going to establish that. Yes, God exists. All right, let's go beyond that. Is the New Testament reliable? That's the next ring. And his is much more complex. And so for William Lane Craig, he's building faith in the unbeliever gradually, systematically. And then for him, he's like, I don't try to get non-believers to believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, until they are already believers and they're being discipled. So chronologically, as he goes through these circles, he would put inerrancy out here. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I have trouble arguing that. And I don't want to fault somebody on an analogy too much. No analogy is perfect. But what William Lane Craig says is, hey, as a defender of the faith, because I put inerrancy somewhere out in the peripheries, I don't want to defend it. I mean, I believe in it, I teach it, but I don't want to defend it. I want to kind of hold it a little loosely too, because I'm an apologist, and we focus on the central stuff. He says, hey, if you got a spider web, you want to protect the center of the spider web. You don't really care if you get a hole out here in the periphery. So that's his argument, and I took this analogy. I thought, well, this is fascinating. Let me think about this some more. And again, no analogy is perfect, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, hey, you know what? When I want to destroy a pesky spider web, I don't poke holes in the center. I don't poke holes in the peripheries either. You know what I do? I grab a stick, and I go for these peripheral guide wires. I don't even mess with these so-called viscid segments. I go for these guide wires, because they're the ones that support the whole structure. So I think the problem with this view is it's too simple. The analogy is too simple. In fact, this leads me back to why I've been harping on shipwreck and talking about ships in the ocean. This is a more complicated analogy. This is one that Jude used and the Apostle Paul used. So that's my main response, is this analogy is too simple. All right, so now when we're talking about targets for arrows and spider webs, things that don't move, peripheral matters are not that important. But what about things that move and carry passengers, like ships, like airplanes, maybe traditions, movements, schools of thought? I flew here. I flew to Charlotte from Dallas on an airplane. Now, when the mechanics did their pre-flight check of the aircraft, I would be very bothered if the mechanic said, hey, on this side of the peripheries of the airplane, under this wing I see a leak of hydraulic fluid. A little hydraulic oil has puddled beneath this wing. On the other wing I see a little puddle of jet fuel. But you know what? I don't care about the peripheries. All that matters are the people inside the cabin of the aircraft. That's all that matters. The central stuff, the fundamental stuff. That's all I care about. I don't want a mechanic that thinks like that. I want the mechanic to say, look, this is part of the, either the navigational or the guidance system of the plane. If something goes wrong with one of those peripheral things while we're flying at 600 miles an hour, 40,000 feet up in the air, best case scenario is we don't land where we thought we were going to land. That's the best case scenario. So ultimately my response to this is let's embrace a little more complexity. Let's move beyond the target analogy, even beyond the spider web analogy, and let's go to Paul's analogy of shipwrecks, winds, waves, hidden reefs. It's more complicated. That's what church life is about. That's what, if you're going to talk about schools of thought, traditions, the future of your seminary, things like that, let's embrace a more complex analogy. All right, with that, I will ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, I have a question. When you compare Bart Ehrman and what he says now about Jesus and Templeton seemed to say some positive things about it. And Bart Ehrman answers the question. I was speaking recently at the University of North Carolina, and a student asked him this question. This is what they said he answered. Do you miss your relationship with Jesus? And he said, no. I miss my relationship with other Christians, but I don't miss my relationship with Jesus. How would you compare those two, and why do you think there's that difference between Templeton and Ehrman?
All right, so the question for the recording is, let's compare Templeton and Ehrman. Templeton, at the end of his life, said, I miss my Savior, even though he'd chucked the faith. By contrast, Bart Ehrman recently was asked, do you miss your relationship with Christ? And he said, no, not a bit. What's the difference between the two? Now, first of all, let me preface by saying I don't have a great knowledge of Bart Ehrman or Chuck Templeton. I've never read either of their biographies, but I would say my knee-jerk reaction is, here's the main difference. Chuck Templeton was at the end of his life, old man, on his deathbed. And I think you look at life differently. Now Bart Ehrman, he's at the top of the crest of his wave. I mean, he's surfing his wave. He's getting invitations to speak. His salary depends on this. And I think there could be other motives or other factors. But I would say let's ask that same question to Bart again when he's on his deathbed and see if he'll be honest then.
Is it possible that one of them had a relation with Jesus and the other one didn't?
Is it possible one had a relationship with Jesus and one didn't? Wow, yes, I think it's very possible. And In fact, I like one of Dr. Geisler's analogies about faith. He taught me that, how do you say it? He said there's a difference between believing that and believing in. He said, before I got married, I thought, yeah, I could give intellectual assent to the idea that Barbara was a great woman. I could give intellectual assent to the idea that, yes, she would make a great wife. I could give assent to all these propositions as true. Did that make me married to Barbara? No. So, I think it's safe to say that people like Riza Aslan and Bart Ehrman, they grew up with an inherited Christian faith, and that's another problem. If you inherit your faith from your culture, your family, have you really made it yours? Does God actually have grandchildren, or does He just have children? So I would say it's extremely possible that you can hold to a Christian worldview, and you could even put check marks beside the propositional statements of the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Say, oh yeah, I believe that, I believe that, I believe that. You may not still have a saving faith. You may not have a relationship with Christ. I think, and there's debate about this, of course, but I think faith is more than just believing propositions. It's not less than that. I mean, the Book of John ends saying, you know why I wrote this book? I wrote this so that you may know about what Christ did and said and believe in His name, and in believing in His name have life. Sorry, I misquoted it a little bit. So yes, we do need a propositional faith. We do need to say, yes, those propositions are true. But does that save you? I think, if I understand saving faith properly in the New Testament, there's more to it. It's not just saying, yes, true, yes, true. It's an investment. You divest your trust, your faith, your reliance. You divest it from all those idols that you used to rely on, including yourself. Say, I'm not trusting in myself or Buddha or some other savior. I'm not trusting in that anymore to make me cool with God. That's not what I'm investing my reliance in. I'm changing my investment. I'm investing my reliance on the crucified, risen Jesus Christ alone. Or as Dr. Geisler once put it, he said, you know, there was an extra step I had to take, going beyond, yes, Barbara would make a good wife. I actually had to ask her to marry me, you know? And I think similarly, I think there's something to say for falling on your knees at some point. After you believe the facts, falling on your knees and saying, Lord Jesus, I take you as my Savior. I want to enter into that relationship of you are the Savior, I am the saved. So going beyond intellect into the act of the will is the way I would put it. I can't really speak about Bart Ehrman, didn't know him in his early days, but it's extremely possible. Same for Riza Aslan. Chuck Templeton, who knows? I hope that on the other side of life and death that we'll find out that some interesting things happened there on his deathbed. I hope. We'll see. All right. Should we call it good? Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Presentation.
Thank you so much.